The Renaissance had reached its greatest glory. Leonardo, Michelangelo were already part of the past. Henry VIII ruled over England, and the Spanish had encircled the globe. Yet in a land known as Muscovy, the Dark Ages lingered, and the nation struggled daily to avoid economic and political collapse. The force that would save it was embodied in a man, a volatile mixture of piety and ruthless intrigue, whose cunning and cruelty would one day control the largest nation on earth. His enemies and friends alike were victims by the thousands of ruthless ambition and very possibly madness. He unified his country, but made his people pay in blood. Despite this gruesome toll, his story was deemed so crucial to Russian morale that a monumental film about his life was commissioned during the grimmest days of World War II. He was Ivan IV, the first to rule his country with the new Russian title of Tsar. Tsar Ivan the Terrible. On August 25, 1530, inside the Kremlin Palace, a child was born, a first son, to Crown Prince Vasily III and his wife. The child, named Ivan, entered the world in a shadow, the focus of a dire prediction that many considered a curse. A holy man had given the proud ruler an unsettling prophecy. You shall have an evil son. Your nation shall fall prey to terror and tears. Rivers of blood will flow. The curse was not unwarranted. Ivan's father, Vasily, had earned the church's wrath by defying strict decrees against divorce. In the quest for an heir, Vasily had succumbed to drastic measures. After 20 childless years of marriage, the aging monarch desperately needed a son to continue the family line. His barren wife, Solomonia, was sent to a convent, and he wed the 23-year-old Elena Glinska. This unsanctified union resulted in Ivan, and the boy was named after his revered grandfather, who had started the empire's revitalization. Ivan's childhood was marked by illness and darkened by tragedy. 2 years after his birth, his father, Vasily, the ruler of Muscovy, died unexpectedly at 56 years old, the victim of a boil that grew infected and turned gangrenous. Elena, Ivan's mother, then took over as regent, attempting to solidify support for the policies her husband began. Yet she only lived another 6 years, poisoned, according to many accounts, by her enemies at court. So Ivan, at 8, was an orphan, forcibly kept apart from his deaf-mute brother and his maternal relatives, raised by a series of ever-changing maidservants and advisors. As depicted in the famous Sergei Eisenstein film, Ivan the Terrible, the palace courts and lavish churches of the walled-in city called the Kremlin would be young Ivan's only playground.
This child could see that people were bowing to him. He saw how he was being glorified. At the same time, he saw they had no respect for him because he was a boy. It was this contradictory reality that formed an incredibly complex character who trusted no one, but was utterly convinced of one thing: I am God on earth.
The boyars, the elite ruling class, were in control. When Ivan reached the age of 17, they decided it was time to make him Muscovy's official crown prince. The people needed somebody, a figurehead to rally around. Ivan resented the boyars. He felt they were too powerful and couldn't be trusted. On the advice of the head of the church, he rejected the title Crown Prince for a title more ancient and glorious. He would be Tsar, the Russian form of Caesar. Ivan was the first Russian Tsar. In this remarkable filmed recreation of Ivan's early years, the Tsar was depicted as a strong but just ruler. There was never a hint of the enduring reputation that one day would spread terror and fear among Ivan's own people.
Отныне русской земле единой быть.
In 1547, the future looked bright, and soon after being crowned, Ivan prepared for marriage. Tradition required that hundreds of virgins from the very best families compete for the honor of bearing the heir to the crown. In practice, though, very few women met the boyar advisors' strict political criteria. From this small elite number of candidates, Ivan selected Anastasia Romanova Zakharina, a member of a non-princely boyar family. Little is known of their life together, but evidence suggests they were devoted to each other during good times and the bad ones that still lay ahead. The marriage would also be forced to endure the harsh realities of life in the tumultuous, nearly bankrupt country Ivan had inherited. Compared to Europe, Russia was primitive. It was a nation with no banks, no formal roads, or essential infrastructure to support commerce and trade. Ivan initiated important reforms almost immediately to address these vital issues. But there were obstacles. He was unable to exert his authority in much of his vast realm. In Moscow, he had to contend with the intrigues of an ambitious court. And perhaps most threatening were foreign enemies poised on all of Russia's borders. In the first year of his rule, Ivan was challenged by a catastrophic event. A sudden wind-stoked fire that came sweeping through Moscow, a city of wooden buildings, destroying almost two-thirds of them, including part of the Kremlin. In the fire's wake, a mob attacked the Kremlin, captured a relative of the Tsar's who was thought to be responsible for starting the blaze, and murdered him. Ivan retaliated. He arrested the political adversaries who he believed had started the riot, took them to Red Square, and hanged them. The Tsar had acted swiftly and decisively, a bold act for a ruler who was still in his teens. But the far greater challenges of 1550 Russia almost surely lay ahead. If Ivan was indeed, in the words of the prophecy, an evil son whose nation would fall prey to terror and tears, those terrors were already storming the gates. Ivan, only 17 in the year 1547, had already felt the first rush of imperial power. He had crushed domestic foes with fatal force, yet the nation itself was a far greater challenge. 4 to 7 million people, half of France's population in the mid-1500s, lived on nearly 750,000 square miles of dramatically varied terrain. To the west and north, hostile nations prevented ready access to Baltic Sea trade routes. To the south and east, the country's foremost enemies, the Tatars, stood between Russia and expanded trade with Asia. The Tatars, descendants of Genghis Khan, were notorious conquerors. They looted Russian villages, raped women and kidnapped both women and men, the adolescents and adults, to sell as slaves throughout the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire. Their ceaseless aggression forced Ivan, at the age of 22, to mount his first attack on Russia's enemies. He led his army to the Tatar fortress city of Kazan, 6,000 Russian soldiers to do battle against 30,000 Tatars, in command of a stronghold that had never been breached. But Ivan had at least 2 advantages that he felt would assure him of victory. The skills of his trusted young general, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, and something that his predecessors never employed, gunpowder. Ivan hired Dutch engineers to build tunnels underneath the seemingly impenetrable garrison walls. Then barrels of powder were rolled in and set off. After a 5-month siege, Kazan, the gateway to Persia and in time the farther reaches of Siberia, was now in the hands of the Tsar. As news of Ivan's victory reached Muscovy, his stature was quickly transformed. He was no longer Ivan, the boy they called Tsar. He was now Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. Terrible was meant as a term of respect for a leader who possessed awesome power, a cunning commander whom enemies feared. The irony would not be apparent for years, the years of cruelty, torture, and murder that still lay ahead. For now, it was a time of celebration. To mark his victory at Kazan, Ivan commissioned the construction of a magnificent new cathedral in Red Square just outside the Kremlin walls. It would be dedicated to Basil, a native Russian saint. Yet the beauty of St. Basil's, which has lasted more than 400 years, has a darker side. To ensure that the cathedral was unique, Ivan is purported to have blinded the architect, ensuring that he never created a similar cathedral elsewhere. It was a strange reward for something so eternal. And while the truth of the story is in doubt, there are many who agree that the Tsar was a man who was tottering on sanity's edge. If anything was holding him back, it was probably his wife, Anastasia. The Tsarina had been Ivan's confidant since the time he ascended the throne, and in those 13 years she had borne him 6 children. She may, in fact, have been the only person in the court whom he trusted. Then, mysteriously, she began to decline into a lingering illness, which grew steadily worse, ending in death. The effect on Ivan was crushing. She was the one person close to a man who was raised in a virtual vacuum, raised with no source of family or emotional support. Anastasia was everything that Ivan never had. And at 30, he had lost it again.
Anastasia was his beloved first wife. Apparently she was very beautiful, very compliant, and when she died, he was grief-stricken.
There were rumors which Ivan had heard since his childhood, that his mother had not died a natural death. Now he suspected Anastasia had been poisoned as well, and he actively sought out the killers with a passion that suggests paranoia.
Although women were important in palace life, they were not considered proper participants in real knock-down, drag-out politics. So I think that one would probably not poison them or murder them.
Yet Ivan's distrust of those around him was building. In a mockery of a trial, the Tsar condemned 2 of his own most faithful servants for the deed. One committed suicide. The other, in an isolated monastery, perished under mysterious conditions. His vengeance spent, Ivan seemed to quickly recover. He focused on matters of state with both clarity and shrewdness, including the choice of his mate. He would marry 6 more times, not for love, but for political advantage.
When the Tsar picked the bride would come, but she would never come alone. She would come with her aunts and her mother, and she would also come with her father, her uncles, and her brothers, who would instantaneously become very important boyars. What Ivan does, by trading wives so quickly, is that he promotes and then demotes all these relatives, giving the aristocracy very little time to sort of realize what's going on. So the question is, why does Ivan do this? By marrying so often, it's clear, to me at least, that Ivan was doing what he could do to ruin the system, the political system.
The system that Ivan was determined to undermine gave the boyars sweeping influence that stood between Ivan and the government reforms he desired. Through marriage and other ploys, Ivan collected the power he needed to reduce the boyars' influence and impose his own authority. It was a process that took time. But over the decades, the Tsar acquired far more than power. He gained both prestige and world influence, bringing Russia far more closely in touch with the nations of Europe and the modern world. At the same time that Ivan was solidifying his power and the influence of Russia with the rest of the world, he was senselessly imposing bloody tyranny on his nation's own people. It is a conflict that historians still struggle to reconcile. The image of a leader who was trying to bring order out of chaos, and that of a man who, by all accounts, was sinking into madness. The Ivan of the great victory at Kazan in 1552 had become, after Anastasia's death 8 years later, Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of unpredictable and violent behavior. Yet throughout his long rule, he never lost sight of his ultimate goal: to strengthen Russia's stature in the world. He used foreign trade as his primary tool, and England was his favorite business partner. Yet when he tried to forge a Russian-English military pact, Queen Elizabeth refused. Ivan was undaunted, but he responded with a completely outrageous request. Could the Queen recommend an English princess who would make him a suitable bride?
He was married to his 7th wife at the time, and one of the English diplomats in London who was talking this over with his diplomat, with Ivan's emissary, noted, well, isn't the Tsar married already? And the diplomat said to the British diplomat, well, yes, but we can dispense with that fairly easily.
Not surprisingly, nothing came of this request. Nevertheless, English diplomats and merchants, undeterred by hints of Ivan's brutality, became the first Europeans to gain ready access to Ivan and the Kremlin agencies. And it is possible that Ivan's reputation was unfairly blackened by the same Europeans who considered Russian rulers outlandish barbarians. Merchants and diplomats were fascinated by their ostentatious wealth and equally ostentatious piety.
The dinner continued about the space of 5 hours. All the tables were served in vessels of pure and fine gold. The emperor never put his morsel of meat in his mouth, but he first blessed himself, for he is very religious. Servant to Richard Chancellor, merchant explorer.
In the monasteries, however, monks were chronicling very different events. They recorded executions, and worse, that Ivan decreed for no apparent reason at all.
Among some of his most horrible tortures, which I hate to recount, are boiling people in oil. A mild one was just cutting out someone's tongue because he displeased him. And another favorite was impaling on a stake. And this was a very long, drawn-out death. But again, we have similar things in Western Europe. This is not unique to Russia. But Ivan somehow got the reputation.
Some of the atrocities attributed to Ivan may have actually been committed by others. Legendary yet historical figures like Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, known to later generations as Count Dracula.
There were some stories borrowed from the Dracula myths, for example. The story of ambassadors appearing to Ivan's court, refusing for cultural reasons to take off their hats, and Ivan's nailing the hats to their heads.
Others are convinced that the exaggerated violence of Ivan's regime was directly connected to madness.
The phenomenon of paranoia has been studied for at least a century, and I think there is fairly wide agreement about what it is. And Ivan fits all of the traits. Paranoia is not a disease in which somebody foams at the mouth, wildly waves his arms around. Somebody could talk to Ivan the Terrible and have not the slightest suspicion that he is a paranoid.
Over the last 2/3 of his reign, the acts of terror seem related to increasing mental illness. If a general lost a battle, he was sure to meet death on the block. Prince Kurbsky, Ivan's friend and the great hero of Kazan, decided to defect to nearby Poland. In a letter to Ivan, he accused the Tsar of murder. Ivan was quick to respond. Everything he did was God's will. It was done for the sake of the nation. But that was often not enough. Ivan seemed just as determined to make sure that the souls of his enemies went directly to hell.
In the 16th century, what was considered to be particularly frightening was not to die, but to die and not to have anyone say prayers for your soul after your death. And so that's why it is alleged that he exterminated anyone who might possibly say prayers for people who were his perceived enemies.
If Ivan feared those who said prayers for his victims, the proof of his increasing paranoia may be found in something far more extreme. In 1565, in a far-reaching move that caught both boyars and the European diplomats off guard, he created the Oprichnina, a police state within a state, whose officers, the Oprichniki, were responsible only to him. Each member had to swear complete allegiance to the Tsar, declaring that his loyalty to Ivan came before that to his parents.
The oprichniks themselves were dressed as monks. They wore all black, a hooded cowl just like a monk. They had black horses, and they were dressed to inspire terror, so that their insignia was a dog's head to sniff out treason and a broom to sweep it out. And they did inspire terror.
The intimidating Oprichniki swept across the land, claiming all the prized estates of the boyars in the name of the Tsar. To oppose this elite private guard meant excruciating torture or death. The Oprichniki also joined with regular army forces to commit Ivan's most notorious act of violence, the sacking of Novgorod in 1570. Basing his actions on rumor alone that the large ancient city-state to the northwest of Moscow was going to align itself with Lithuania, Ivan took action. With an army that only knew where it was going when its generals got new maps every day, Ivan moved his troops in total secrecy. If a traveler stumbled upon them, the traveler died, to prevent any news of the army's movements from reaching a town. During a 5-week occupation, Ivan tortured and murdered the civilian and the military leaders of Novgorod, then turned his attention to the massacre of thousands of its ordinary citizens. This scale of the carnage was far too great to escape the attention of foreigners.
His guard ravished all the women and maids, murdered the people young and old, ransacked, robbed, and burnt all their household stuff. Sir Jerome Horsey.
Soon after Ivan's onslaught at Novgorod, the Tatars set fire to Moscow, an event the Oprichniki were unable to prevent. So Ivan now made a policy reversal that convinces some his illness was at bay. After 7 years of terror, torture, murder, and greed, Ivan dissolved the Oprichnina. He had realized that the men who had once vowed to be the most loyal had instead abused their power at the expense of the country's most precious resource, the Russian people. Yet, in years to come, Ivan the Terrible would once again commit a heinous crime, an act so vile that even he could never wash the sin away. By 1568, Ivan had ruled as Tsar for 20 years, and at the age of 37, had begun a descent into the mind's darkest recesses, where his enemies, both real and imagined, lurked everywhere. So he retreated inward, into the palaces, into the churches and governmental buildings of the Kremlin, into isolation in a city surrounded by walls. Ivan spent most of his life in the candlelit rooms and among the inner circle of advisors where secrecy, security, and intrigue were the ground rules for affairs of state. Increasingly, the brooding Tsar resorted to the same simple, brutal solution.
Of late, the Tsar hath beheaded no small number of his nobility, diverse others have been cut in pieces by his commandment. I intend to be soon out of this country, where heads go so fast to the pot. Sir Thomas Randolph, 1568.
Strangely, while Ivan continued his intrigues and tortures, his devotion to the church grew more intense. Prayer and monastic retreat became an inseparable part of the ruler's routine. The head of the Orthodox Church, the Metropolitan, was Ivan's most trusted advisor, confessor, and friend. Metropolitan Makary was the only one who ever seemed able to reason with the always unpredictable Tsar. After Makary's death, other churchmen weren't as persuasive and found themselves sent off to distant monasteries. Yet Ivan's devotion to the church remained steadfast.
Ivan's religiosity was definitely real. It was not, however, the kind of religiosity that says Christians should love one another and that sort of thing. Quite the contrary. Ivan would often schedule his masses and decide on torture sessions and what kind of tortures during the masses. So it's a very mixed picture.
There was another odd aspect to his murderous demeanor. Ivan the Terrible had a passion for music.
It's fairly clear that he composed some church music in his lifetime, but this need not have any bearing on his conduct, just as Western Christianity has no bearing on the conduct of crusaders or any of the other butchers in Western history.
Ivan may have been a butcher indeed, but he did seem to care for his family. Of his 6 children, just 2 survived: Ivan Ivanovich and Fyodor. But there was nothing caring in the crime he soon committed on his eldest son and heir, the 28-year-old Ivan Ivanovich. There are 2 versions of the tragedy, though both agree on where they occurred: in the bedroom of his son's pregnant wife. One tale claims that Ivan had wanted his son to divorce his 3rd wife and marry a woman whose family had better political connections.
The younger Ivan evidently objected. Some sort of quarreling broke out. The situation got heated. Ivan struck the younger Ivan in the temple, produced very quickly his death.
The second account claims that Ivan had overreacted to his daughter-in-law's choice of clothes.
According to the story, was sitting in her room in the summer in 1 chemise, whereas Muscovite etiquette said you have to have 3 chemises. And Ivan entered her quarters and he struck her. At which point she cried and her husband came to the rescue. Ivan hit him with a cudgel and he died.
In a rage, a father killed his eldest son, the chosen one he'd groomed for the throne. Regardless of which version is true, Ivan Ivanovich had died at the hand of his father. And Ivan's murder of his son will help throw Russia into devastating turmoil. Tsar Ivan the Terrible, in the 34th year of his reign, had murdered his son. It seemed as though the prophecy made decades ago had now been completely fulfilled. The nation under Ivan did indeed fall prey to terror and tears in an era of incredible violence, upheaval, and unprovoked torment. From the burning of Moscow and the hanging of the henchmen whom Ivan suspected of starting the riot that followed, his reign had been a litany of horrors. The hero of the siege of Kazan, Cel Groaznic, the awesome conqueror of foreign invaders, had descended from grace into madness, where everyone was suspect, and security was guaranteed by terror and fear, by surprise, and by murder. The irony is that Russia had thrived. It was now a world power, a trader with Europe and Asia. And though his son was cut down, the father built up his nation still more, beginning the expansion into Siberia, which would give Russia access to vast forests and rich mineral deposits. While his nation was expanding, Ivan's own movements decreased. He was plagued by constant, agonizing pain that doctors, even those brought in from England, couldn't cure. He remained a feared and powerful ruler, but one who was essentially confined to the realm of the Kremlin itself. There, after a lifetime spent fighting real and imagined enemies, with terror, torture, and murder, Ivan's own death came quietly and naturally at the age of 54. It was said to have struck as he was setting up a chessboard on his bed. The death of the Tsar, whom nobles and peasants had feared for almost 2 generations, was still a catastrophic event. Everything Ivan had managed to gain was about to be lost in the reign of the man who became the next Tsar. Ivan Ivanovich, the son trained to rule and then killed by his father, had been dead for 3 years when his younger brother Fyodor ascended the throne. Fyodor was retarded and no match for the intrigue and factional fighting that came with the crown. Russia slipped into a dark, chaotic period called the Time of Troubles. "400 years later, a modern-day Ivan ran the country with the same iron hand. Joseph Stalin, the totalitarian despot who commissioned the filming of Ivan the Terrible, had a point to make as Hitler invaded Russia. The nation, Mother Russia, was in jeopardy, and the people needed someone to inspire them. Stalin looked to the Ivan of Kazan, the Ivan of national unity, the Ivan who, like Stalin, put the country's survival in first place and the people's survival dead last, whether it be generals, poets, or peasants. When Stalin died in 1953, permission was granted to exhume Ivan's corpse and subject it to the scrutiny of modern forensic research. The remains solved a mystery 4 centuries had hidden from view. Analysis of the bones revealed that Ivan the Terrible had suffered for years from a painful and incurable arthritic condition. It had been treated with the popular painkillers of the day, painkillers compounded with mercury. Mercury, it is now known, can cause wide shifts in behavior, including fits of murderous rage. Through scientific reconstruction using his disinterred skull, we know what he looked like. But much about his life remains mysterious and controversial, including a question still relevant today. Did Ivan shape Russia, or did Russia shape Ivan?
Who was Ivan is one of those central questions being asked today when Russians ask themselves, who are Russians? When you talk about the biography of Ivan, you're really talking about the biography of modern Russians. You're getting at their conceptions of themselves. And that's, I think, the most important legacy that Ivan has for us today.
Ivan has been dead for more than 400 years, but the nation he helped to create endures. So vast, complex, and varied that it still challenges comprehension. Just when observers think they've come to understand it, Russia always seems to change, confounding them. Its true nature, like that of Ivan, remains elusive. Stalin resurrected Ivan's valor. Science determined the facts of his health. But every generation will debate his character. Ivan the Awesome of Kazan, or the man condemned as Ivan the Terrible.